Hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. My name is Megan Whitman, and I'm the director of the Lambert Center for Arts and Ideas. I hope we find each of you safe and healthy at home. Tonight is the second installment of the virtual series we launched called Authors in Quarantine, Community Book Talks with Julie Baer. This is one of many virtual ways that JCC is connecting with our community right now. So please join our email list and check our website to learn about other offerings, including daily meditation, yoga, art classes, and more. While we can't see you in the building, we really would love to see you online. Tonight's conversation is in the capable hands of our friend Julie Baer. A native New Yorker, Julie began her career as a bookseller at Shakespeare and Company. Her first job in publishing was at Stanford J. Greenberger Associates. Julie started her own agency, Baer Literary, in 2004. In 2015, with 3 other partners, she launched the Book Group. Julie represents a variety of writers across a literary spectrum with a special emphasis on fiction. Books she's represented that were published in the last year include Inheritance by Danny Shapiro, Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson, Writers and Lovers by Lily King, Patsy by Nicole Dennis Benn, and Dear Edward by Ann Napolitano. There will be time tonight for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit yours at any point during the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Julie will be back with more amazing authors in July, so please stay tuned for details. And lastly, if you have not yet read The Book of V, I encourage you to order through our friends at Book Culture, who are making special arrangements for ebooks as well as contactless pickup. And now join me in welcoming Julie Baer.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm so excited to be here. I want to thank you and Matt and everyone at the JCC for making this series possible. It's really fun for me. And I'm so excited tonight to be welcoming my dear friend and client, Anna Solomon, whose incredible new novel, The Book of V, just published as we were entering these crazy days of COVID and quarantine. Anna and I have been working together since 2012. She first came to me when she was finishing up her second novel and a few months before she gave birth to her second child. And we really, I think, clicked immediately when we first met over a very delicious breakfast, if I remember. I had read her first novel and loved it, and loved hearing about her second book, which is called Leaving Lucy Pear, which you should all pick up as well. You're going to love that too. So I'm excited to have her here, and I'm excited to talk to her about her writing process and creativity, and this book in particular. And I wondered, Anna, if you could start off by talking a little bit about what your writing life and routine was in the before times, as I like to refer to them, and how those things have changed, both your routine, but also maybe your feelings about writing and your feelings about creativity and your work.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be talking to you and seeing your face. I wish I could actually see you, but thanks to everyone for being here tonight. This is such a treat. I'm a very disciplined writer, I would say, or a writer that sort of, I can't really I can't make my work if I don't have a clear routine. And I've always been a morning writer. And that has adjusted, at different times in my life, like before kids and then with kids. And then when I moved back to New York City. So now in the before time, I worked in a shared writing space where I would go and pick a new desk every day, not wipe it down, sit down, not a particularly clean place, just kind of sit down and start to work and pass all of these other writers on the way and take that morning time. I turn off all internet, really, really focused time. And I've been pretty ruthless about it. It's been the only way for me to do it. And then I sort of after lunch in normal times sort of open up toward my other work, like teaching and writing copy and household things and family things and all of that, and sort of let it in after that point, and emails. I really keep the morning pretty protected.
I know that to be true because when I called you with the very exciting news that you had been selected as Good Morning America's book club pick. You had not checked your email because it was a morning, and you were very diligently writing, and I was like, look at your email!
I was like, no, I haven't checked my email. That was a pretty good one. I really liked that call. Yes, that was great. So yeah, I'm very ruthless about it. And it's good. And I think, as we all know, especially as I became a parent, sort of we can talk more about this, but just like the ways in which, how easy it is to give up time. And for, it's the easiest, everything else is easier to do. And everything else is something that someone's asking you to do. And there's really never anyone. I mean, you're there and I know you're like somewhere in my head saying like, go write Anna, or like my editor, but it's not really like, it's not a daily, nobody's checking in with me daily to be like, did you go to work today? And so it has to come from myself. And so anyway, things honestly have been pretty mixed up since quarantine. I got in a bit of a pattern before the book came out, because when we came up to Massachusetts, which was where I am now and where I grew up, and where a bunch of this book is set. And I developed a kind of like early morning wake up, like really early, like 6 to 8, before managing children's school schedules for the first time in my life. And then in the promotion of the book is always a time when I'm not writing, to be honest. So it's been a little bit weird the last month, but I'm just now, like today and yesterday and starting next week, really getting back in a schedule. And I think it's going to be different, and it's going to involve getting up pretty early and carving out probably 3 hours that are mine to really focus and have that creative time. And then later in the day when I have pockets where I can check in on email and deal with other things, but I'm not going to give that time to those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's harder to be creative, to think creatively right now? Are you more distracted? Not just with the obvious, right, raising 2 children and trying to get through a summer with no camp and all that stuff, but just in terms of everything that's going on and kind of the silence you need around you to generate ideas.
Yeah, the word silence is interesting. It feels like I feel just so there's no silence. And that is in between the news, between the world, and a lot of it is stuff that I really like want and need to be paying attention to. And also that one thing that's really clear to me, like the new book that I've just begun working on, I think is sort of set it was at least set in a near future. And, back in February, imagining that near future seemed really hard. And now it sort of seems like, well, not even possible.
Yeah.
like what was I thinking? And so I think it's impossible for me to, it's been interesting to think like, how do I move forward with this project in this moment where, I'm not someone who does quick takes. Like, I'm not the kind of writer who's like, there's this stuff going on and I'm going to tell you, like, it takes me years to sort of, and to have kind of to let it settle and come out in fiction. And so I think it will influence the book that I thought I was writing, but I don't know how yet. So I just need to get back into the thinking and the writing and see where it will lead, and kind of trust the process and be okay, I think, with how unknown and noisy the moment is, and still allow myself that space to sink in, even if it feels somehow like I'm betraying the world around me to like just
turn to your work and give it that chance. Yeah, but you have to. I mean, I'm excited.
I'm glad.
And I'm excited to talk about this book. Could you read a little section for us? I'll just set everybody up by telling them a little bit about the Book of E in case you haven't read it, which is that there are 3 primary storylines in the Book of E. There's a story set in contemporary Brooklyn about Lily, who is a mother of 2 ferociously wonderful, opinionated young daughters. We know nothing about those.
Nothing.
She's a second wife, and she's struggling with questions of her identity. She was a writer before she was a mother, and now she's a mother. Is she still a writer? Is she a working mother? Does she want to take time off from working and teaching and writing? She's also a daughter. And she's a second wife, and she's dealing with, I think, a lot of things that so many of us would recognize. The second story is Vivian Baer, or as we like to call her, V, who is the daughter and granddaughter of politicians and the wife of an up-and-coming politician. Her story is set in the 70s in Washington, D.C., and she's really discovering herself and what it means to be the wife of someone. Does she want that role? Is she really ready to step into the shoes that she feels she's inherited? What are the choices available to her about motherhood, and is she interested in re-examining those choices? And then the third story is the woman that we all know of as Queen Esther, from the Purim story. And her story is really two parts because it's entwined with the story of Vashti, Queen Vashti, the woman who came before Queen Esther, who, like Lily, is a second wife. So that's a little bit of the setup. Anne is going to read a little bit for us, and then we'll talk about those strands and how you came to them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to read actually from the very opening of the book. I think of this as sort of the prologue to the book, and a lot of you in the audience tonight are probably familiar with the story of Purim, and this is meant for you, and it's also meant for readers who might not be so familiar, and it's titled, the chapter's titled Esther for Children and Novices, and here you find Lily, our Brooklyn mother of two. I don't need to say much more because it's at the very beginning of the book. Close the book now, close it. Look, the story's simple. Persia, once upon a time, king banishes queen. Queen refuses to come to his party and parade in front of his friends. Naked is what most people think he wanted, and he sends her away or has her killed. No one knows, she's gone. Vashti this is, her name's Vashti, you know this. And then the king gets sad and wants another wife, so he calls for all the maidens to come and win his affections. A maiden? A maiden is a girl or a woman who isn't married, kind of, right. And the maidens come and put on lots of makeup and smelly oils. But when it's time for the beauty pageant, the king chooses the maiden who doesn't try too hard, the one with just a dab of lipstick or whatever they used, Esther. She also happens to be Jewish, though she doesn't mention that. She's very pretty, yes. No, she's not a princess. She's an orphan with an uncle who looks out for her. But then this uncle also winds up getting her into trouble because he refuses to bow down to the king's minister. And the minister gets mad, really mad, and decides it's time to kill all the Jews. And then things get kind of messy, but the details aren't that important. Most of them contradict each other anyway, which is why I'm tired of reading you this book and why we're going to put it away for a while. I know you like it, but I need a break. Okay, so the new queen winds up being really brave and going to the king without his permission, which is a big no-no. Remember what happened to the first queen when she did the opposite? And the new queen asks the king to save her people, and then the king, even though a few minutes before he was fine with having all the Jews killed, gets really mad at his minister and has him killed instead. Also, he thinks his minister might like his wife, like daddy likes mommy, so that makes him kill him too. But I can see this isn't making sense. That's why we're done with the book. It's not simple at all. I don't know why I called it simple, and twice a day for a month is too much, and we're done. Really, all you need to know, and all anyone ever remembers anyway, is that the second queen, Esther, is the hero. Lily tosses the book out of the girls' bedroom into the hallway. It's a children's book, the biblical story dumbed down, but still it's convoluted, full of plot holes and inconsistencies. After they're asleep, she'll drop it into the recycling bin. Then later, admitting to herself that it won't be recycled, she'll shove it deep in the kitchen trash. Her husband may or may not be home by then. He is deputy director of programs for Rwanda at a major humanitarian aid organization. She is his second wife. So tomorrow, girls, ushering her daughters into their bunk beds, I'm going to learn to sew so I can make your costumes for the Purim Carnival. Remember, we dress up like characters and then they act out the story and everyone boos at the bad minister and cheers for Esther. I don't know what happened to Vashti. The book doesn't say. No one knows. Heads on pillows. If you don't want to be Esther, tell me in the morning. Otherwise, you'll be Esther like all the other girls. Good night. Sweet dreams. No more words tonight. Love you to the moon and back. Eyes closed, mouths closed. Stop talking now. Good night.
I love that so much. I think I love it because there's so much there to identify with, and I mean the story, and like clearly the story makes no sense, and I'm telling you the story as if it makes sense, but actually I have no idea what it means or whatever any of us are supposed to take from it. And you know, I wish I'd read the crib notes beforehand on how to explain holidays like Purim to your children. I think I love it so much because it sums up the madness and joy, but also hecticness of motherhood. So I mentioned when I first met you were pregnant. with your son, Sam, who is almost exactly a year older than my son. And actually, the first book that we worked on together officially that I sold for you was an anthology called Labor Day, which was an anthology of birth stories, which I remember at the time that you pitched to me, and I was like, I mean, sure, if you're, if you feel strongly about it, you must. I remember being like, who would really be interested in that book? And then like 2 months later, I was pregnant. And I feel you and I have always had this connection, motherhood, maybe because our sons are close in age, or you were pregnant when we met. You sent me so many wonderful notes and gifts, and one of my favorite children's books. Although for a while I didn't know it was you who had sent it.
That's right. I forgot about that.
All the world, in case you guys are wondering. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that motherhood plays in your writing, and writing plays in your role as mother. They're so intertwined.
No, I know. It's so funny because I was thinking about this and how the ways in which sort of the motherhood, the way it's shown up in my books has changed, over the course of them. I mean, I had never written a book before. My very first book, I sort of became pregnant in the middle of writing. And so, and there was actually this sort of whole scene that takes place during a blizzard that's people kept saying, this is just so intense and dreamlike. And it was like, well, that's when I was basically asleep for the first trimester of my pregnancy, and I was having a dream of a book. And it turned out that it really worked for that scene, but I was like, I was barely conscious. But so anyway, I mean, that's an extreme example of motherhood playing in. I mean, I think mostly it's subconscious, which is how most of my writing works. It's not like except for Labor Day, obviously. In my fiction, I don't set out like, I want to explore such and such about like motherhood myself, or about my mother, or about what it is to be, I don't start with the ideas. I really start with the characters and a story that I want to tell, and then a structure, and then inevitably like all of my obsessions just like come pouring out in the book. And I mean, I think in this one I was more, and maybe this is part of just becoming more and more in control of one's material. I mean, I like to not have full control the first draft, because I think then it becomes less interesting and it becomes less like I wouldn't want to write if I knew everything about what I was writing.
Right.
But I think I've gained more understanding. And I think in this book in particular, in the Book of V, at some point I was like, oh, I really am writing about my mother here, and what my relationship to her as a daughter, and then what it has been to be a daughter who's now a mother of a son, but in particular of a daughter as well. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I don't think I really took this in until honestly May 5th, when this book came out. But like, this book for me, and I don't mean this in a trite way, but like, it feels like not an apology, but sort of saying to my mother, like, oh, I see you, like, I get it. And in that way, and just like, and I'm sorry, not like I'm a terrible person, but just like, gosh, this is hard. This is really hard. This mother thing. And I really get it. And it's here in this book. And I think she really feels that. And so I think that, I mean, so in that way, like, my becoming a mother just becomes part of my work, inevitably. And I think my work, what was the other part of the question? Like, how
something you just said made me think about how the book is so much about the choices we have as women and the choices we don't have, and how that has or has not changed over time. But really, for 3 women that are spanning hundreds of years,
yeah,
very basic things that don't really feel, they may be presented like they're choices, but we don't really feel that society or culture is actually letting us make those choices. And I think that one of the things that the story does so well, and that you're talking about, is how when you're young and you look at your mother, you don't see them as a human person, you just see them as your mother. And then when you have children, you suddenly realize, like, oh, she was constantly having to make choices. And those choices were, a lot of the time, I think, like, do you get or do I get, right? Like a
Oh,
lot of motherhood is,
yes.
you know, I mean, sometimes it's as simple as like, my son went through this phase. I love to eat pomegranates, you know, pomegranate seeds, and you know it can be very expensive to buy them. I like allow myself this little treat and this little, and then he discovered them, and there would be like this one expensive pomegranate, and I'd be like, no, it's okay. You can have half my pomegranate. It's torturing me, you know.
It's so funny that you bring that up because I've thought about this a lot, and it's not something I've written about yet, but I do. But in particular, I've thought about appetite and hunger and like the ways in which I perceived my mother's, who is a very like great, you know, as I am, like a very like an eater. I love to eat. She loves to eat. But she would like, you know, eat off of our plates, and she would, you know, and it would just feel to me like, you know, not just the sort of disgust of any teenager or of any child who's just like, oh, mom, you are disgusting, but also just this feeling of like you're taking, like you're claiming something for yourself.
Wait,
and I think
as a mother, you're like, who do you think made that food?
right.
Paid for that food. I'm like,
Right.
took the time out of her day to give you that food.
Right. And if I don't eat, how will we all, like, I will blow my top, and I will also not survive. And like, there's all of this,
putting your oxygen mask on first.
right. So you realize there's this sort of expectation, the expectation and the convention in a sense is to put oneself afterward. And I think that, and that's true for people who are like you know, that's not just true for writers or people, you know, that's like true for all mothers, I think. And so wrestling with that and how it's really complicated. It's
and
really
how much I think all the characters, like 2 characters in this book who are, or 3 actually, you know, who are thinking and talking about motherhood actively. Actually, 4. I don't know why I'm taking Esther out of that conversation.
That's true.
Are really, it's really fundamental to their identity and their hopes and their dreams. This choice of like, can I have those things and be a mother and be a good mother?
You know, one thing that's been really striking to me about in the pandemic, and I've been hoping to write about this in some way, is that, you know, I think so much of, for me, and I think a lot of women who, whether it's that we work or whatever we've needed to do in addition to mothering, we've spent a lot of time sort of developing the boundaries, right? And figuring out where the boundaries are. And so, so it's like, you know, the first year of being a mother,
space, that's your boundary.
right. And like, and this is the children, oh wow, the children become 5 and they go to school, like that's a boundary. And then suddenly, like, there are no boundaries. And also for me, and when I publish a book, it's like the boundary is so big. It's like, goodbye, I'm leaving now. And I'm gonna go, like I'm actually like leaving. And when I'm doing events, I'm like by myself beforehand and afterward. And so
tell me,
right. And but I mean, one of the things I've been kind of thinking about, there are obvious things that are like, oh my God, about like, I finished one of these events and I press leave, and then I'm like, what can I make for you? Da, 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 da. But I've also been thinking that there's probably something, you know, there's something kind of a gift in realizing in what happens if we allow these people to be integrated in a way that our kids can see too. Like, I do think there's a gift for my kids to see me working and to see me like touring, and to see me saying like, no, goodbye, I have to go do this thing. I'm not leaving the house because I can't leave the house. There's something, I'm still kind of thinking it through, but I do think that there's, not that I would ever choose to do this again, but I think that there's something kind of fruitful in it as well.
Yeah, we have a weekly meeting. Our agency is still having a weekly Zoom meeting, as we had one in person every Tuesday, and we're doing it by Zoom. And inevitably, everybody's kids have come into the Zoom over the last 14 weeks, because they're like, I'm having a problem connecting to my classroom. I don't understand the math or whatever. And I have really loved that opening up of that, like, work time, home time. But it, as wonderful as it is, it's hard. And it's, you know, going back to the beginning, to the part that you were reading, to this idea about this weird holiday that we don't
such a weird holiday
explain very well. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what was the jumping off point of this book for you, and what made you start to think about this story?
Yeah, I mean, I had always, since I was a little girl, and, the Purim celebrations at my synagogue, like at many, and many still, were pretty, conventional. There was a spiel, and there was, there was always a Vashti who was dressed usually like a prostitute. Sometimes there was she was a leper. It was unclear exactly what was wrong with her, but it was clear that she was very bad. And then she was gone. I mean, that was the big part, was then she just disappeared. And I mean, I didn't think in these terms then. It was well, her disappearance is what allows the story to happen, right? I didn't think in that way, but I was what? I was more just who was that? And wow, she was bad. And then, and go Esther, yay, Esther. And then as, when I returned, I think it really was this children's book that came into our lives, as children's books do, sometimes ones that you love and sometimes the ones that you're and I was reading this story again and again with my kids, and I was this makes no sense. And wait a second, I thought that Vashti was supposed to be the bad one and the wanton one and the all of these things, and Esther was the pure one, the virtuous one, and the brave one. And it seems as if Vashti told her husband that she wouldn't march naked in front of him. I don't get that. Why is that whorish? And wait a second, if you really read this, Esther's basically a concubine in a harem. I'm so confused.
So confused.
And then there's all the other stuff which you saw in that passage, and the king also really says, yeah, kill all the Jews. And then, there's it's a big old mess. And it's, and it's really like a burlesque. It's a farcical, it's a very fun book when you really dive into it. But that kind of led me back to it, into thinking about Vashti. And I've always loved books that take a sort of side character or maligned character from one book and kind of bring them up, Wide Sargasso Sea, where you see the mad woman in the attic from Jane Eyre is suddenly the main character, and you're oh wow. Or Grendel is a great one, where with Beowulf, suddenly the monster is the narrator, is the main character. So it sort of came out of that interest, and then as I went, it also it tied into my interest in general in the ways that I think many of the stories that we're told, not just in the past but now, about women, really brought have very little room for anything beyond types, again, good and bad and virtuous and wanton and brave and meek. And, it's which type are you? And I was really interested in kind of exploring that and also kind of exploding it. Well, what if, this is not the case. This is not, the reality is much more complex. And I want to write a book that captures that. So that was a big part of it. Yeah.
I love V so much, as you know, and I love this time period of 1970s Washington, D.C. And there's a really juicy scene, for those of you who haven't read it, at the beginning of the book, right at the beginning of V's section, and it talks about her going to her first women's consciousness raising meeting, her talking to her doctor, very, not being able to look him in the eye, but asking about the birth control pill, thinking about a lot of things that she's never thought about before. And I wondered, what was it about that period that made you want to set her in that time?
Yeah. Things she's not only thought about, but things that she doesn't think she is allowed to think about, right? Which is the thought police. Yeah, I mean, so many things about the 70s. I mean, I was born in the 1970s, so there's always been this fascination for me, because there's so many, the myths of my family becoming a family are all set there. But really, I felt, I was really interested in what happens if I take this Vashti character and sort of transpose her into the second wave women's movement, basically, in the United States, in this moment where where sort of what it means to be a woman is all of a sudden kind of up for grabs, and to a certain degree, and there's all of this foment and there's all this excitement, and there are women of all, I've been watching Mrs. America. I mean, there's it's not like everybody's aligned. There is, and so, and what happens, what I was really interested in was what happens if she is really in the middle herself and really torn and feels like she doesn't have any real clarity, except that she knows that something in her doesn't feel right about sort of the convention she's been expected to follow, chiefly like that she's going to become a mother. Like she doesn't even know why, but she just doesn't want to have a baby.
Right.
And so, and then I was interested, and then what happens if like the women's movement sort of embraces her as having taken a stand, right? When it was really for her, it was a very personal choice.
She wasn't interested in being political.
Right. And I'm always interested in that way in which, you know, people make choices that are purely for themselves, and then they're like understood to be stands that they're taking.
Right.
And so, and then I think I realized this recently, that it wasn't until after the 2016 election that I decided that I understood exactly where I needed to set this book, which was in 1973 during the Watergate scandal. Like it really helped me clarify this moment in terms of the kind of license and licentiousness of and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. at that time. So then that kind of helped clarify, not that I would wish it again, but it helped me clarify, like, this isn't just the 1970s. Not, I was going to set it somewhere, but I hadn't really found my moment. And then I was like, oh, here we are.
Yeah. There's a great scene at that party where they're all talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, and one woman's like, yeah, not really meaningful in any way.
Right. Yeah. And then someone else is like, but also like, if we do pass it, then it's just going to placate people and make them not fight for more. Right. I mean, there's so much to think about in relationship to where we are now. And yeah.
It's great for that reason, I think, because it's a great juxtaposition.
Right. And it's true, I will say, which I think is part of where this book came for me, is that and the ERA did not pass, as we know, which is insane. But I did, by the time I was coming of age in the 90s and in the aughts, there really was a sort of message for women of my age and women who were like, I was studying feminist theory and history. And the idea was that it really was history. Like we were sort of done with it. We were in a post-feminist world. It wasn't cool.
I was a women's studies major, and it was all like, history
in the past.
Yeah.
And so I think that, that was part of what was really driving me with this book too, which I started again before the 2016 election. And I think since then, obviously, people's general consciousness, I think, has changed dramatically in really important ways. But it would have been interesting if this book had come out in like 2015, if people would have been like, I don't believe, like things aren't so bad. I don't know.
Right. Can you talk along those lines? Can you talk about the sampler?
Oh yeah.
I love your story about the sampler, your own personal story.
Yes. So there's an embroidery sampler in the book, which Lily, you heard Lily, her mother hung on the back of her bathroom door growing up. My mother hung this sampler on the back of my bathroom door growing up. Not a lot of this book is straight from my life, but this part is. And the sampler reads, "A well-kept house is a sign of an ill-spent life." And I and Lily, read this, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of times, not taking in until really like now or recently, like, but wait a second, like my mother was keeping our house. And like, what does it mean? So what it meant to her was that, or she says, she didn't keep it very well, right? And so that was her point of like, well, it was different than how I was raised. But if I really look and like enumerate the various things she did to hold that house together, then what does it mean to call what you spend your life doing a waste of time? What is that? And what does that do to one's psyche, right? And then what does that do to like our collective psyche? And I do think so many women, including myself, are caught in this place of having not been taught to value the things that we wind up doing. To get this degree or that degree, and then to wind up like spending a lot of time, like, and just talk about the last few months, like literally sitting and like talking about like, what is division? Like, I don't want to do this. This is boring. I want to write another novel. Like, so
totally.
And like, does that mean it's a waste of my time? Like how could it feel different if we had been in some way able to value that? Would it have to be that we would then be like Phyllis Schlafly being like, everybody must, like, if we don't value, like if we don't make everybody stay home, then we won't value it. Like, could we all accept that we all could make different choices and that could be okay?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
And could you, as an individual, make different choices at different times?
Right. Which of course, that's our life winds up being made of many lives, right? And many phases, and absolutely. So that sampler plays a key role in the book on a psychological level, and then on a plot level later, which I won't give away. Like there's this revelation later in the book that comes out of that embroidery sampler. So that was very fun to figure out.
That was fun. And there's also a sewing kit.
There's also a sewing kit, which is another thing I took from my own life. Vivian Baer's grandmother gives it to her, and my grandmother gave this to me when I was 9 and going away to summer camp in this very dour. She was a very the kind of very practical Jewish, there was literally no need for frill in life ever, just nothing. Her idea of fun was baked apples. and she was like, take this kit, you might need it. And I mean, what struck me later, and I wound up taking it and never, it was closed for years and years and years. I never used it, and I didn't know how to use it. And it wasn't until my 20s that I finally opened it up. But the point is sort of that I kept it with me. I knew that I shouldn't get rid of it. So I kept bringing it everywhere, bringing it to college, and bringing it around in my drawers. And it was sort of this other piece of my, I guess, exploring what do women do and what do they not do? And
Lily in the book, it's a huge source of embarrassment that she doesn't know that she's supposed to sew her daughter's prom costumes, and she doesn't actually know how to sew.
Right. And so it's in there, it's she's embarrassed about it, and she also judges the women who do know how to sew as being sort of retro. She can't get out of her all of exactly. Yeah.
Was there anything that surprised you coming out of writing this book? Something that you learned about yourself or about the process, or something that you hadn't expected?
I think that, I mean, there were many things, but I think one thing is that I expected, and one might expect, that because my trappings are sort of closest to Lily's, that she would be the character that I would most closely identify with. And I think in some ways that's true, but what I found, I think, surprising in a really not just joyful, but kind of exhilarating way, I guess, is that I really identified with Esther and V too, in maybe even more so. And, in the sense of, their circumstances are so different from my own, but their questions and their, the ways in which their experience of feeling pressured or trapped or feeling or experiencing their own power too. There were so many ways in which I found it very moving to write them, and I felt very close to them.
It comes across, I think, on the page. I mean, I think it's a remarkable accomplishment to write 3 women across time in such different circumstances, and to have all of them feel so real and so realized, and really interesting to examine them and say, what has changed for them in terms of their choices, the stories that they tell themselves about their lives, and the stories that get told about their lives.
Yeah, and I think that I do think at its core, this book is so much about, and even that essential, where I came to in terms of the poem story, where is the gap between the story we've been told about the story and then the story itself.
I love that part.
And I think, but I love that you said that too, because one thing I've been hearing again and again from readers is a lot of people being just I couldn't figure out who my favorite was. I would get to this one and be but I love hearing that. And some people do have, they're like, oh, I loved it, but I was really into Esther. I loved it. Yeah. And that's been interesting too, because people have had very different, it hasn't always been everybody's into one.
Right.
So it's been really interesting to hear that, and very gratifying. Yeah.
So cool. We've come to turn the table around portion of our evening, where I like to offer you the opportunity to ask me a question, should you care to. So yes, if you, Anna, have a question for me.
Oh, me. I'm sorry. I thought you were You were saying you, and I was
Before
thinking
we
the
jump,
audience. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
before the audience-
Sorry, I went blank basically. I know. I do have a question for you, Julie.
Okay.
So, and it's sort of, I've never asked you this, I guess. I'm just so curious about your like schedule and figuring out how on earth you get what you get done. And in particular, your reading, because I know I don't understand how you read. And just for the people in this audience, like I mean, not to whatever, but like Julie just like, it seems like she must read like literally a book a day, because it's not as if she's just reading. So I don't know, I'm just blown away by it, and the work that you put into it, and not like reading in a skimming way, but like editing. And so how do you figure out, like, do you have a very clear idea before you start the day, like this is how it's going to go? Or
yeah, I mean, I rarely read manuscripts during the week. My manuscript reading is almost always on the weekends. Before I had a family,
right.
I would set aside the entire weekend for reading, and I would just bring home like a giant stack of manuscripts and a pile of books that I had gotten galleys of or had picked up at the bookstore, and I would just sit down and spend the weekend.
Yeah.
It was great. It was so great. And I loved that. And that obviously is not possible when when your life expands in the wonderful ways that it does when you have kids. So yes, I very much think every week, okay, this weekend I'm going to try and get through the following manuscripts, and maybe one of them is a second read on a draft where I'm just taking notes. Maybe one of them is an actual line edit on a manuscript that really needs a careful revision. Maybe one of them is just a first draft where I'm really just like, is this working? Is this not working? And probably 2 or 3 are just like the big, queries that I've accepted that I've said I will read, and I'm going to dip into and see if there's something there. One of the amazing things about marrying a writer is that my husband is a writer, is that he really understands and values and respects the time that I need for my work, just like I do his. So we sit down on a Saturday morning and we're like, okay, when's your reading time? When's my reading time? When's your writing time? When's my editing time? Like, how are we going to divvy up the weekend? And I'm very lucky to have family in the city. To sometimes come lend a hand baking with my son while I get some editing done, and sometimes I call in a sitter. But it's a juggle, but it's also so fun. I mean, that's like the best part of my job, like I didn't get into the business because I love negotiating contracts.
No.
Nothing's better than working on a marketing plan. So I still have that like,
right, like
open the box and see what's inside, and then I try to read for pleasure in terms of not my own books at night. Even if it's just a little bit before I'm falling asleep. I tend to do a lot, like when I have a vacation, I tend to just like read like 10 books in a week, which I love. And I, people are always like, wow, you make time to read like finished books and published books. But I'm always like, but that's why I got into the business.
Right.
Not all the great books in the world are going to be by my clients. There are going to be some other people's out there. And
75%.
Right. A few. And it's part of my job to really understand like what's working in the marketplace and why does everybody love that novel, and what, that review said the structure is really interesting. I should really read that and see what's so interesting about the structure. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a juggle. It's definitely a juggling act. And what's great about being married to a writer is sometimes like, I'll be like, I haven't gotten back to that person. And he'll be like, you've had it how long? Oh my God, I'll take our son. You've got to read that and get back to that.
Writer.
He identifies with the writer who hasn't heard from their agent. So yeah, I'm glad you feel that attention. That is a joy to do, and just a joy to collaborate with a writer like you who's so responsive to editing. I mean, I feel like we've had so many great conversations these last 2 novels about what's working, what can work differently, what's not working, what are we trying to get.
Yeah, I love that.
I love that too.
Yeah, very grateful for
That part is
yeah.
really fun for me too.
Yeah, it's amazing what goes into any, I mean, it's like my books and other, you know, it's like there's so many people who have worked so hard to make these books what they are. And
it's a team sport, as I like to say.
Yeah.
Would you read us a tiny bit from the book just before we go to audience questions?
Yeah, so this is just from the Esther part. I thought I had it marked. Okay. No, sorry.
And now's your time, audience, to start sending in your questions, thinking about your questions. Just type them in and we'll get to as many as we can.
I'm sorry. Why did I not have this?
And if you guys haven't had a chance to buy the book yet, once again, strongly encourage you to pick up your copy. Book Culture, you can order from bookshop.org, which is shipping all over the country and is an amazing alternative to Amazon. If you don't know why you need an alternative to Amazon, there's a thing called Google. I urge you towards it.
Please.
Please support the independent bookstores in our country, which right now are suffering extraordinarily. And, we're down to about a third of all independent bookstores are operational right now. So they really need your support.
Really, really, really. And Book Culture already had to close one location this year. I don't know if you already said that. Sorry, I was busy looking.
No.
Okay. Yeah, that would be amazing. Please. I am going to read. So this is very brief from sort of the quote, the original pageant from we're in Susa. We're in 462 BCE right now. She is in the bath when the girls are called. A procession, she's told, a parade before the king, and instantly the number of days she's painstakingly stored is yanked from her mind like a thread. 120, what? It doesn't matter now, she tells herself as she's wrapped and shoved toward the oiling room. Tonight, she will fail to become queen, and tomorrow she'll be released. Jostling for space in the dressing room, she slips on her aunt's prized muslin. Other girls laugh, prompting eunuchs, none of them Baraz, that's her eunuch, to rush over and strip the cloth off her. Esther waits, naked, for whatever robe or dress they'll bring, trying to ignore the battles around her over powders and combs and who will walk first and who last. The smell of balms and oils and cinnabar mixes with the frenzy and heat to produce an overpowering stench. She breathes through her mouth and looks for Lara. And Baraz, where is he? Other eunuchs return to wrap her in a white silk robe. They tie the robe with a gold sash and push a brush into Esther's hand. Her hair is grown out past her shoulders now, a thick, ink-colored curtain that months ago overcame her chop job. She ties it back with a leather string and abandons the brush on a nearby table. Every surface is covered in brushes and paints and pots, and somewhere, probably, the pomegranate paste she carried with her that first day. There's enough coal and cinnabar in the room to paint the girls inside and out every day for the rest of their lives. But thankfully, Mona and the eunuchs are overwhelmed now, too busy to notice Esther and force her, so she will go before the king as she hoped to go, in her bare face.
Love that. Oh, those of you who have not read this book are in for such a treat. Okay, we are going to take some audience questions. So I am going to bring them up here on my screen. Can a childless woman relate to the story? It sounds like there's a heavy emphasis on motherhood. Absolutely. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. I mean, Vivian, I don't think it's giving away too much to say that Vivian Baer chooses not to have children, and her life is very much defined by, and I think, I think her life is really made by that choice. And I won't give this away, you see how that, I think it's the right choice for her. It's clearly the right choice for her, I guess is what I would say. And so it's an important part of the book. And I think the ways in which other women in the book do wrestle with motherhood are also very much speak to the choice whether or not to have a child. So I hope that it will. But yeah, one of the three main characters makes the choice not to enter motherhood.
And I think that happens to be something that you and I really connect on and have talked about, but it isn't it's a big piece of the story, but it's not a defining piece, in that I think there's so much other angles and other parts of the story to connect with that have nothing to do with motherhood. Okay, one question says something that I don't want to give away. But what was the process that you used to come up with the supernatural aspect of the story of Esther?
Okay. Yeah, so I granted Esther, not just Esther, I granted sort of some magical powers to the world of ancient Persia. And I did it, I think that's a great question. What was the process? So, there were various parts. I've always been interested in sort of a strand of Jewish, not just mysticism, but sort of a strand of magical realism that has run through Jewish storytelling for millennia. And I've always been attracted to it and interested in it. And again, I was drawn to some of these stories that were coming into my house via my children, like ones about goblins, and which feeds into this book. There's this goblin that shows up in the Persia parts that really causes all the trouble. If you really want to like blame it on someone, it's the goblin. And that happened, actually, I will say, very organically. And then I stepped back and thought, like, well, what am I doing here? What am I playing with? And I think there were two main things. One, it really gave me a chance to play around with the idea of power in a way that took it to another level, and not just the power, but the limits of power, even when they are magical powers. And another thing that was very important to me to make really, really clear, and I don't just do this through this, it's in the language of those stories as well, to make it really clear that I was not attempting sort of a definitive, like, here's what happened in ancient Persia during the Book of Esther. I wanted to make it, like, there be no doubt. And not only was I not interested in writing that kind of book, but I didn't want it to get confused in that way. And so that was also a way of me kind of pushing that envelope further and saying, like, you can see that I'm playing here. This is a, this is me exploring and playing and not dictating. Yeah.
Did you do a lot of research into the original story?
Yes. And actually, I mean, that played into it too, because one of the things that you find when you start to look at, not so much when you start to look at, like, well, what was it like in ancient Persia during the time of the Book of Esther? What you find is that almost all of the resources point you to the Book of Esther, and that it's taken as the history. Yeah. And I mean, there's an epigraph at the beginning of the book from Elizabeth Cady Stanton in which she refers to the historian. And that's how this book was viewed, and still is probably by many. If you're a fundamentalist, like, you read this as truth, right? But it was taken to be, and taken by people, a lot of non-Jews as well, as a historical document. And partly that's the language is in the book like that. It's all about records and annals and, like, on this day, and all this official language.
Yeah.
So but then I spent a huge amount of time with the commentary and with, like the Babylonian rabbis and these rabbis, and then more, a lot with, 19th century writers, and then into, especially, like, really interested in the 1970s and what sort of what feminists did as they were reclaiming Lilith, and as they were reclaiming, Eve, and all of these other characters, like, what did they say about Vashti? And so there was a lot of, I'd say a lot of research, and more than that, like, just so much reading.
Yeah. I think I'm looking to see. No more questions? No more questions. So I think we will wrap it up.
Okay.
And thank you so much for joining me tonight. This has been such a pleasure. I love talking with you. I love the book. I just want everybody to read it. Go out and buy it, please. It makes such a difference to authors when you actually purchase their books. And I love libraries, and I believe in libraries, and I support libraries, but books are how our authors and our artists make their living, and it's really important to support them right now. I hope you all had a chance to take a look at the email that Anna and I sent around last week, and I appreciate everybody understanding that we felt that we wanted to move the event. There's a great list in that email of Black women authors that I really, really urge you to take a look at right now. they especially don't get the kind of attention and sales that they deserve. And this is an opportunity to start righting that wrong. You can go buy their books anywhere, bookshop.org, but you can also support some of the wonderful Black-owned bookstores that I think were also on that list. I will be back in July with two other wonderful writers that I represent. Lily King, who's the author most recently, she wrote Euphoria, which I think a lot of people know as a historical novel, and Writers and Lovers most recently, and Madeline Miller, writer of two historical novels about Greek mythology, The Song of Achilles and Circe. And I'm really grateful to the JCC and to Megan and to Joy Levitt for giving me this opportunity to talk with writers like Anna. It's been such a pleasure. So thank you all. Stay safe. Wear your masks, people, and go buy some books.
Thank you.
Thank you.